Alright, so today I'm going to show you how to transplant our pepper and our tomato plants. Now there's a few reasons why you want to transplant your plants. Essentially they get too big, right? They get too big for the small little containers that we've started them in. When they get big, the roots start to get bound inside the container and they start to use up a lot more water, and so you're going to find your containers are drying out a lot more faster, your soil's drying out a lot faster. They're also going to start crowding each other out as they get bigger. Now I'm not really having those problems with these plants. They're still probably a little bit too small to transplant. These were some of the baby runts that were left over after I transplanted my other ones. So I just thought I'd use these to show you though the technique in transplanting. I wouldn't transplant them, like I said, until they get a little bit larger. They should have at least a couple of true leaves on them, not just you'll see when tomato seedlings and pepper seedlings come up, they'll have the first two leaves. You want to wait till they've got a few more leaves on that at the very least before transplanting them. And so what I'm transplanting them into, I've just got some larger containers here. The same potting mix, so this is just any potting mix from any store or garden center will do. It's mostly made up of peat moss and some perlite, maybe a little bit of fertilizer that's already in there. Don't add any fertilizer, just whatever comes in the standard potting mix. And so a little bit of different technique for the peppers and for the tomatoes. And so for most plants that you're going to transplant, you're going to want to very carefully pinch out the plant, okay, maintaining the roots intact. And you can see we've got our little plug there for the plant that's the same shape as the container that it was in. And so I'm just going to use my finger to make a little hole, a little cavity here where I can fit that plant in there nicely, and keeping the top of that plug at the same height as the soil. And I just want to very gently just sort of tamp that in around there to make sure that it's nice and secure. And that's it. That's really all you need to do to transplant a pepper plant. The tomatoes, you might find, get a little bit taller, a little bit lankier or leggy, and so they've got this long stem on them and they might look a little bit weak or a little bit fragile. And that's okay, because with tomato plants, same thing. You can just kind of squeeze it out here. And with tomato plants, you can make that hole way deeper, and we can sink that way down in there. And we're going to tuck that tomato plant in right all the way up along its stem. So tomatoes are kind of unique that way. It doesn't have to be planted to the same depth, whereas peppers and most other plants have to be planted to the same depth. That tomato plant, we can sink right down and bury its stem so that its stem is covered in soil. And if you look really closely at a tomato stem, you'll see all these tiny little white hairs on there. Those are actually roots that will start to grow out inside that soil and make the plant a little bit stronger. So don't feel bad if your tomato plants are tall and lanky and don't look very strong. When you repot them or transplant them, you're just going to sink them down a little bit deeper and cover that stem with soil. And then the last step when you're done transplanting or repotting your tomatoes and peppers, you always want to make sure that you water them really well after you've transplanted them. They might experience a little bit of transplant shock where they get a little bit droopy, but just make sure you water them really well after you transplant them, and they should recover just fine. And there you go, some repotted or some transplanted tomato and pepper seedlings.